So hello and welcome. I'm Gretchen Mays. I'm the Center's membership director, and I'm filling in for Paula Simmons today. Today, we'll be joined by two of our experts at the center, Tiffany Yap, who is our senior scientist and wildlife corridor advocate, and also our deputy Florida director, Elise Bennett. We're also joined by Joe Malisi and a wonderful behind the scenes crew from the center's membership staff. And perhaps running a tad late, we might also be seeing Kieran Suckling join us as well. Just on behalf of everyone at the center, I'd like to relay how truly grateful we are for your generous support. And we really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us today to learn more about the center's work. So today, Tiffany and Elise are going to be discussing the center's campaigns and legal work to expand wildlife connectivity and save habitat for endangered species. During the talk, everyone will be muted to cut down on background noise, and we'll turn audio back on for you when we get to the Q&A portion of the session. The call is being recorded, and we'll email you a recording within the next couple of days. Thank you again, everyone, for being on the call today. And I will now turn the call over to you, Tiffany, to take us into your presentation.
Great, hi, thanks so much, Gretchen. Let me, I will share the PowerPoint that I have for everybody. Can everybody see that? I hope that that is working properly. And I will assume yes, and I will just get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm Tiffany Yap. I'm a senior scientist and wildlife connectivity advocate at in the Urban Wildlands program at the center. And I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about our work protecting pumas and wildlife connectivity in the urban wildland interface. All right, so just real quick, I wanted to give a quick definition of what the urban wildland interface is. It's the transition zone between human development and undeveloped wildlands. And so it's places that you might think about from your childhood if you spend time in nature, maybe the creek near your house or a field you ran through by your school or a nearby park where you would meet friends. It's often where people have their first interaction with nature. And it's where people and wildlife share space and interact the most. It's also where a lot of the impacts of habitat loss and fragmentation are happening and need to be remedied. Yeah. So for example, roads are a huge barrier to wildlife movement. They fragment habitats and affect a wide variety of species, from long-ranging or wide-ranging animals like mountain lions and bears and deer, to even small, less mobile species like salamanders and snakes. It also affects birds and fishes and insects. There are just so many different ways roads impact wildlife by slicing through these different habitats. Unfortunately, it's difficult to quantify the scale of the impacts to animals because there isn't a lot of data, but we do have some estimates, and those estimates show that the lack of connectivity affects both wildlife and people. So a UC Davis Road Ecology Center recently reported that over 44,000 wildlife collisions with large mammals were reported in California from 2016 to 2020. And every year that kills about, those kinds of collisions kill about 5 people and injure 250 people every year. The UC Davis Road Ecology Center estimated that the cost from 2016 to 2020 from human loss of life, injuries, and property damage was over $1 billion. And what's really frightening is that these incidents are often underreported. Studies suggest that these could be happening at 3 to 9 times higher rate than what's being reported. And then there, again, as I mentioned, a lot of other species are being affected. So researchers estimate that up to 340 million birds are killed on US roads every year. And we don't really know how many amphibians and reptiles or small mammals or insects are being killed on our roads, because those kinds of things aren't, like, there's just a lot of data gaps. So to highlight the potential magnitude of the issue for some of these smaller critters, I just wanted to show you this iNaturalist community science project that documented the impacts of one road on newts migrating between their upland habitat and their breeding pools. So this was at Lexington Reservoir, and community scientists documented in 4 breeding seasons, they documented over 23,000 California newts killed on the road on just a 4-mile stretch of road. And scientists estimated that this population is experiencing 40% annual mortality rate on this road. And they speculate that these newts could become locally extinct if nothing is done to improve connectivity for them. But luckily, we know of effective solutions. Wildlife crossings, when they're properly designed, have been shown to decrease wildlife collisions by up to 98%, while facilitating wildlife movement. We've seen animals use the crossings, and we've seen plant diversity increase after connectivity is restored. And so I just wanted to show you a few examples of like wildlife bridges and underpasses and culverts that were built for wildlife to use to safely cross roads. But sometimes wildlife crossings can just be upgraded culverts. So here, these are examples of ramps that were built at existing culverts so that animals could access them more easily and cross the road safely. And so these types of crossings are really cost effective. The savings over the long term from prevented collisions surpass the initial cost of implementing a crossing, whether it's an upgrade or a bridge or an underpass. And so we really just need to protect existing connectivity and implement more wildlife crossings to reconnect habitats and maintain healthy ecosystems. And there are several ways that we're working towards that. So our California mountain lion work is an example of how we're pushing to improve wildlife connectivity while protecting a sensitive species at the same time. So in 2019, we petitioned for for mountain lions in Southern California along the Central Coast to be listed as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. And that was because in 2018, researchers came out with a study that showed roads and development were severely fragmenting mountain lions and creating genetically distinct populations. And so if you look at this map, each color represents a different genetically distinct subpopulation. And there are 6 subpopulations in Southern California along the Central Coast, some of which are experiencing an extinction vortex. So populations like the Santa Ana Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains populations are experiencing such high levels of inbreeding and such low levels of genetic diversity that scientists predict if inbreeding gets worse, then they could become locally extinct within 50 years. And so what's involved in this extinction vortex is a lot of different things that are all very human related. Again, the roads and development are causing genetic isolation that's causing them to inbreed more because they're just getting really boxed in, but they're also being killed on roads. They're being killed after depredation events. They're dying from rat poisons, from wildfire. There's so many different factors involved in this extinction vortex. But the primary driver of it is this lack of connectivity. And so, pumas are really important for a lot of reasons. They're a keystone species. They have intrinsic value. A lot of people, they're an iconic species. People love mountain lions. They have high cultural value, but they're also really important ecosystem engineers. So their kills are a reliable food source, not just for them, but for a lot of other scavengers on the ecosystem. So from bears to foxes, eagles and condors, beetles and other invertebrates that help keep the soils healthy, that then allow plants to be healthy. They modify, not only do they provide this food, but they also modify the behavior of other species on the landscape, which affects how vegetation and stream banks are. So they support a wide variety of biodiversity. And a 2022 study actually found that pumas have ecological interactions with about 500 different animal and plant species. And so we really need to, in order to save these populations, we need to improve wildlife connectivity, and then they can survive and even thrive. So protecting these populations under CISA would help us move towards the goal of safe coexistence, because again, humans are the primary cause of death for these species. If they're listed under CISA, that would help preserve and enhance existing connectivity. It would allow for building greener infrastructure with a lot of those different kinds of wildlife crossings that I showed you. It would also help limit rat poison and minimize conflict with people by increasing education and awareness about keeping pets indoors at night and keeping livestock or pet farm animals in Puma-proof enclosures at night. So in terms of where we are in the CISA process, so again, the center petitioned in 2019 for them to be listed as threatened. And in 2020, they were advanced to candidacy status, which means that they currently have, so they're candidates now, and they currently have CISA protections while CDFW conducts the status review and does a formal vote to formally list. But in that time, since the center has petitioned, there have been steps that have been taken to protect the species. So the state now requires a 3-step depredation policy, which requires people to prioritize non-lethal measures to prevent depredation. And in the first year that that's been implemented, we've already seen an 80% reduction in reported depredation kills. So that was pretty exciting to see. That information just came out not too long ago. We also fight poorly planned projects in the urban wildland interface that threaten pumas and wildlife connectivity. So for example, in 2018, we led a coalition challenging the Altair development, which would have further isolated the Santa Ana puma population. And in 2020, we obtained a legal agreement to protect the critical wildlife connectivity between the Santa Anas and the Eastern Peninsula range for them. In 2021, judges blocked 2 other projects that we filed suits against, the North Lake project and the Centennial project, which are in LA County. And those projects would have harmed mountain lions and other sensitive species like Western spade-foot toads, as well as wildlife connectivity. And so, and also those projects would increase wildfire risk too. In addition to litigation, we also push for legislation and local and regional ordinances to protect and enhance wildlife connectivity for pumas as well as other wildlife. So there's the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, which is an assembly bill. It's Assembly Bill 2344, and the center is sponsoring that. And it requires California to develop a wildlife connectivity action plan, a statewide priority project list, and it requires the state to incorporate wildlife connectivity in new transportation projects. So right now, it passed the Assembly and now it's going through the Senate. And so we're hopeful that it keeps moving forward and gets to the governor's desk. We also supported the Ventura County Wildlife Movement and Habitat Connectivity Ordinances, which identify important connectivity areas and limit development in those areas. And when industry groups challenged the ordinances in court, the center joined a coalition of conservation organizations to successfully defend it. We're also working with the city of LA to draft a wildlife ordinance that aims to preserve open space and encourage wildlife friendly infrastructure in the city. And then we also support connectivity enhancement projects. So whether that's through increasing awareness of the need for them, the importance of them, but also submitting letters of support for funding to go towards projects and pushing decision makers to prioritize these projects. And so these are just a few examples of some of the crossings that we've been supporting. The Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing is probably one that you've heard of. It's the largest wildlife bridge in the world, and it just had its groundbreaking in April, and it's going to span over 10 lanes of the 101 freeway. And so that's pretty exciting. We also have other crossings, including, and we also help, again, in that area where I mentioned there are issues with newts. We are supporting that area too to get some connectivity for newts. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with this video that I think really kind of catches the vibe of how amazing wildlife kind of crossings can be and how important wildlife connectivity is. And that's it. Thank you.
I can't stop smiling from that video, Tiffany. It's so cute. So now, next we'll turn the presentation over to Elise to talk a bit about our work on the other side of the country.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Well, I guess everybody may be at different times. It's afternoon here for me. My name is Elise Bennett, and I am the Deputy Florida Director at the Center for Biological Diversity and also a senior attorney. So I do legal work here in Florida. I hope you don't mind that I talk while I pull this up here. I'm a born and raised Floridian, so these issues, particularly wildlife connectivity and seeing the changes in our habitat here in Florida, feel very personal to me. So it was really fulfilling to be able to create this presentation for you. And so I thought I would start with maybe a little bit of a bold choice to begin a presentation on wildlife connectivity. Instead of putting a beautiful panther or a charming gopher tortoise on the front page, I wanted to start with this picture of a longleaf pine savanna, because protecting habitat is really at the heart of maintaining wildlife connectivity here in Florida. Longleaf pine ecosystems like this one support so many rare and imperiled species in the Southeast, from the gopher tortoise to the red-cockaded woodpecker, but they have precipitously declined over the years and now only cover about 3% of their historic extent here in the Southeast. So this really highlights how high the stakes are. We're fighting to protect interconnected fragments of a fragment. And so to give a little bit more context, I wanted to put these maps up here. As you can imagine, sprawl development is one of the greatest threats to habitat and biodiversity here in Florida, along with climate change and sea level rise. And if left unchecked, this projected development will continue to swallow up habitat and fragment the remaining green and blue spaces across the state, which just further reduces connectivity and isolates native species populations. And so what you see here on this picture is, I got the laser pointer here, there's a 2010 baseline for what development looks like. And you see that these red areas along the coast are the largely developed areas. Over on the right, we have a prediction of what development will look like in 2070. And you see that those red areas have expanded significantly. And I'd like to just draw your attention to this part right here in Southwest Florida, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So now I'm here at our beautiful species pictures. There's almost no species that's really more threatened by habitat fragmentation than the Florida panther. The panther is the last remaining breeding population of puma in the eastern United States, and it once ranged across most of the Southeast. That's that peach area on the map you're seeing. It covers Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, all the way up into Arkansas, although you can't see it here, and then all the way down into Florida. But unfortunately, the sole remaining population now resides in that tiny green area in Southwest Florida. And you may recall that that area lines up very clearly with what projected development looks like in the future in Florida. And with only about 200 individual cats left in the wild, we're really concerned because it means the Florida panther is still in danger of extinction. And its survival and recovery hinges entirely on whether we can help it expand beyond its limited breeding range there in Southwest Florida. So while there are many groups in Florida focused on wildlife underpasses and acquiring lands to form an undeveloped Florida wildlife corridor across the state, the center fills a really unique role by holding the line for species and habitat. And what I mean by that is we work to prevent some of the biggest and most damaging losses caused by development. So for the panther, that has borne out through our work to fight approximately 50,000 acres of development, essentially entirely new towns in the heart of panther breeding habitat in Southwest Florida. And we've done this work on two key fronts. First, we've been taking the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to task as it considers issuing this blanket permit that would authorize the development and essentially okay the death, harm, and harassment of protected species in connection with it. And that includes panthers, wood storks, eastern indigo snakes, all kinds of protected species. This work is kind of an interesting thing to highlight because it gets you a bit of a backstage pass into the huge effort we put in before you ever see lawsuits announced in our press releases and our newsletters. And with this issue, we've been working for years, reviewing thousands of records and submitting pages of detailed scientific and legal comments to convince the service that it simply cannot legally authorize this massive sprawling development because it's going to jeopardize the future for these species, in particular the Florida panther. And so some of the things we've highlighted here is, for one, it would irreversibly destroy habitat in the footprints of the developments themselves. That's a given. But perhaps even more concerning is that it would fragment any remaining habitat with networks of brand new roads. And these roads would increase the number of vehicle strikes that kill these panthers to an unacceptable level. And to give you just an idea of what that might look like, just this year, 15 panthers have already been killed by cars. So now you can step back and imagine the number if new towns were erected directly in the panther's primary breeding habitat. Ultimately, our work has effectively delayed the approval of this terrible project. And as far as we can tell from public records, we've convinced the service that it can't authorize the development as proposed because it would ultimately jeopardize the panther's very existence. And it appears that the agency was very compelled by the arguments we made about panthers being killed on roads. That said, if the agency decides to approve this massive sprawl, we're also equipped to go to court and challenge it. In addition to challenging that Fish and Wildlife Service permit, we're also fighting a relatively new permitting avenue that developers are exploiting on a project-by-project basis to destroy wildlife habitat with really weakened environmental oversight. For decades here in Florida, any project that would destroy wetlands had to get a federal Clean Water Act permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and this would trigger this detailed environmental review process under the Endangered Species Act. It's called a consultation, and also some other environmental reviews. And these processes require a science-based analysis. They provide opportunities for public participation, and they offer citizens and groups like the center the opportunity to challenge bad decisions in court when they may harm species. But in 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency delegated this authority to the state of Florida. And this move has largely removed federal oversight for development projects in Florida. For example, the state has been essentially applying this unlawful policy to determine whether it even needs to review environmental impacts for certain projects that are in wetlands. And also of particular concern for the panther, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service no longer completes formal review of effects to endangered species for each project, and instead offers something that's much weaker. They call it technical assistance. It's something they do to assist the state. And we've observed, as this has been used in practice, that this new kind of species review is cursory at best, and it just doesn't adequately protect imperiled species like the panther. So in 2021, we and many partners sued over this transition of power to the state of Florida. And since then, we've had a small win on motions for partial summary judgment, and we're now preparing to brief the full case sometime in the fall. So that gives you a little idea of our challenge overall to this permitting scheme, which has really been ineffective at protecting species. Unfortunately, because the Center's a national organization, we're precluded largely from participating in state court challenges to individual projects that are permitted under this new scheme. But we always find a way to support and work on these issues. And in this case, what we've been able to do is support our local partners in their project-by-project challenges. And one example of that is we submitted a friend of court brief in an action filed by our partners at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida against a large planned development called Rivergrass that's in the panther's breeding range. And the oral argument in that case is set for early August. So we continue the fight. In addition to that on-the-ground work, we've also been fighting Fish and Wildlife Service's plans to weaken protections for the panther. It's surprising to even hear that would, they'd be considering that, I think. But last year, we obtained records showing that the service was indeed planning to downlist the panther from endangered to threatened. And this was before the agency had even reviewed scientific information about the species status. And just to be clear, there's no evidence to suggest the panther is no longer in danger of extinction. If anything, as this development continues at a rampant pace here in the state, we're even more concerned about the species' future and its ability to recover back across its historic range. And so we put pressure on the service and the media, and we outed their unscientific and apparently politically motivated decision. And since then, the agency officials have told us that downlisting is no longer a priority for them. And for the most part, that appears to be true. We see that they have dropped that from their unified agenda. And it looks like they're now kind of turning back to some of the other work they've been doing for the species. We also got our hands on an advanced copy of the service's recent status review for the species and submitted a letter highlighting serious logical and scientific flaws with their analyses. And that letter has forced the agency to take its unsupported assessment back to the drawing board. They've removed it from their public-facing website, and they're significantly revising it to make sure that this assessment gives a clear picture of the species' true status and what it needs to be protected and to survive and recover, hopefully, in the future. So we'll continue to keep a close eye on the panther and are prepared to fight to keep its protection strong, which, given the panther's massive range, will ultimately serve the greater purpose of protecting wildlife connectivity overall. And as the former reptile and amphibian attorney here at the center, I could not let an opportunity to pass me by to talk about the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise is also incredibly vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. It relies on a mosaic of interconnected upland systems to survive. Currently, this tortoise doesn't receive strong federal Endangered Species Act protections across most of its range, and that includes here in Florida. And unfortunately, our state level protections have really done very little to address the most serious threat to the tortoise, which is urban sprawl. Essentially, Florida just moves tortoises out of the way of development and have enacted some policies recently to make it even easier for developers to move forward without considering the impacts to the tortoise and the habitat that's lost and fragmented in the process. You know, because our greatest concern here is that the state, if it continues to authorize this sprawl without considering how much habitat is left and whether that's enough for the species, we've been pushing really hard for federal Endangered Species Act protections. And in doing that, we've been building a strong record of protections through comments, and we've hastened that decision through lawsuits, and we will have a decision this fall at the latest. And while this advocacy is explicitly aimed at protecting Florida's favorite tortoise, we also recognize that it helps hundreds of other upland species. Tortoises are essentially reptilian architects. They dig these elaborate underground burrows in the sandy soil, and they can be up to 8 feet deep and 15 feet long. And one tortoise can make dozens of these active burrows. And more than 360 species across the tortoise's range also use these burrows. So they kind of build these big condominiums. And so some of the species you see here on the slide use the burrows: the threatened eastern indigo snake, the Florida mouse, the burrowing owl, the spotted skunk. And there's also been a study that showed at least 25 bird species have been recorded using these burrows. And they even use the sandy apron, which is all the sand that gets kicked out of the burrow. They use that for bathing and for foraging. So it's a really fascinating and important aspect of habitat in the Southeast, having these gopher tortoise burrows. So basically, in summary, protecting the gopher tortoise and by proxy, these key upland habitats is really helpful for protecting many species in an area that doesn't often get a lot of protections. We see a lot of enhanced protections for aquatic habitats, wetlands. Uplands often get overlooked. So the tortoise is really the key, we think, to protecting the uplands. And so I'll just end it here. That was a little snapshot of some of our work to secure habitat connectivity in Florida. But you can rest assured that connectivity is a key part of our overall strategy here in the state, whether we're thinking of the tiny Florida tree snail or the majestic Florida panther. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at the end. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Elise and Tiffany, for your beautiful presentations. At this point, as time allows, we'll open up the Q&A. And this is a great opportunity to ask your live questions directly to our panelists. And of course, as always, if we aren't able to answer your question today, we'll be happy to follow up with answers to your questions, both for our panelists or for any other question you may have for Kieran or the center's experts. I'm going to run through some technical details. There are a few options for asking your question. If you're on the Zoom video, you can signal that you'd like to ask a question by clicking the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll unmute you. If you've joined us by telephone and you'd like to ask a question, there are 2 steps. First, you'll let us know that you have a question by pressing *9 on your phone, and then you'll be instructed to press *6 to unmute your phone. You're also welcome to put your question into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, or you can email questions anytime, but today as well, to questions@biologicaldiversity.org, and we'll read it out for you. When you do ask a question, please share your name and where you're calling from. We would just love to know who we're talking to. And with that, I will open it up for questions. All right.
Got a raise.
We have.
Go ahead, Gretchen.
We have a question from someone that phoned in today from a 303 number. And I think your phone instructions should be coming to unmute. So you'd press *6 to unmute your phone.
Hello.
Hello. We can hear you.
Oh,
Ask
okay.
away.
Okay. This is Jan Eckhart. I live in Arvada, Colorado. And I'd be interested in asking Elise if they are getting any help from the governor of Florida.
Yes, are you referring to gopher tortoises or panthers?
Well, anything that you're trying to work with. I wonder how Santos is responding.
Sure. Well, we haven't seen a whole lot of direct action or attention from Governor DeSantis on either of these species. This past legislative session, he actually signed into law one bill that was not great for gopher tortoises. And we sent letters actually to the governor to explain why he shouldn't sign the bill. But unfortunately, he did move forward and do that. And the bill, without getting into too much detail, would basically disincentivize private landowners from protecting their land for tortoises, which is a key aspect to making sure we have enough space for gopher tortoises as development continues. But on the other hand, he also signed a bill for some new conservation license plates, including the gopher tortoise as a brand new one that we've never seen before. And our partners at Florida Wildlands actually will receive the funding from that and be able to disperse that for research on the gopher tortoise and also for conservation actions. So I'd say we haven't seen any direct attention, but there has been some executive action, just signing bills into law that deal with the tortoise itself. I can't speak to anything specifically about the panther, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I question whether he would be very, very helpful along the way.
Unfortunately, not as helpful as we would like.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Got another raised hand from Jeff Depew. Jeff, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself. Go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. A recurring theme seems to be the agencies putting development ahead of the science. How do you get past that? It just seems like it's a rerun consistently.
I can speak to that unless you have any thoughts, Tiffany. Sure. I think there's a few ways to focus on that. What's really excellent about the Endangered Species Act is ultimately decision-making when you're looking at projects like development goes back to what they call the best available science. And so that is a really great way for us to hold agencies accountable for making decisions that actually support wildlife conservation. And that's really the hook we have in addressing that blanket permit I talked about in Eastern Collier County in Southwest Florida related to the panther. But, I think we're considering a lot of other avenues too. For instance, in Florida, something that I think we would really like to see in the right political climate would be a return to more growth management and state oversight for planning, something that we used to have in our state and was largely dismantled, maybe a decade or so ago. And since it's been dismantled, we've really seen a lot more sprawl. So, those are two ways we're looking at it, but certainly it's something we're always thinking about and how we can sort of get at the problem of sprawl.
Will that hold up if the Supreme Court moves forward with I think it's the carbon ruling tied to power plants? And if they limit the ability to restrict that, does that throw out your ability to work through the EPA?
I'm not sure if I can speak to that. I'm not sure how that would affect, but I can think more on that and certainly get in touch with you afterward.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if it's okay, I'd like to address your first question because I don't think I can address your second question. But in California, we also have the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires any developers to do an environmental assessment that includes looking at impacts to biological resources, which includes looking at impacts to wildlife connectivity, and all sorts of other things, impacts to water, impacts to wildfire and wildfire risk, even aesthetics. There's a lot of different things that the CEQA requires. And so what's really great about CEQA, it's a really powerful tool because it allows the public to engage on land use issues. And so when there is a sprawl development that's being proposed, anyone from the public can submit comments and say, hey, you're not using the best available science. You need to consider this. You need to disclose the impacts that are going to be caused by your project, and you have to either avoid them as much as possible and mitigate them. And so if they don't do that, that's when we can use CEQA in litigation. So when I was talking about like the individual projects that we were fighting, a lot of those cases are based on CEQA. There's also the California Endangered Species Act, which is useful because again, it allows us to point to the best available science that shows how these species are doing, if they need more protections, and if they will be impacted by certain land use issues. And then we also are pushing on the other, so in one sense, we are using existing environmental laws the ones that we can that are helpful into protecting species and habitats. But on the other side, we're also trying to push for more policy and legislation that is based and driven by the best available science so that we can then use those as tools as well to implement the conservation goals that we're aiming to achieve.
CEQA seems to be sort of unique. Is there a strategy that you could get CEQA replicated across other states?
That is a great question. It is, I would say California having CEQA is a very special thing. In terms of other states, I don't know if Elise, you know how to speak to that a little better, maybe.
We would love to have a CEQA analog in Florida. I'm not sure how we could get it, but certainly, having strengthened state level laws is something that we do work on. Maybe not at that scale, but we actually have petitioned fairly recently the state of Florida to improve regulations for the diamondback terrapin, for instance. So we do think a lot about how we can improve state laws.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff, for those excellent questions. We have a question from Diana, and she asked early in your presentation, Elise, quote, since the center petition, can you talk about what that process is, what it is to petition? I can't say what specifically she was asking about petition, but maybe petitioning for the ESA or.
I think that might have been Tiffany's presentations.
Yeah, okay, sure. So the process of petitioning for a species to be listed under the California Endangered Act is a very long process. but it involves basically, in order to petition a species, you need to acquire and put together a lot of the different information that's available. Again, the best available science that's out there regarding like the life history of the species, and you know, what is the abundant, like how are they existing now? How are they surviving now? Are they in are they abundant? Are they rare? Are they how is their genetic health? How are their populations healthy? Are the numbers declining? What are scientists saying in terms of where their historical range was and where it is now? Has it really reduced in size a lot? There's a lot of different things that kind of go into preparing the petition. And so with the California mountain lions, really what was driving that was the poor genetic health of those subpopulations in Southern California and along the Central Coast. I mean, some of those populations are really small. The Santa Monica population, I think, has maybe 12, like 10 to 15 adults in that population. And so you can imagine how inbreeding can be a really significant issue for that population. And the Santa Ana Mountains population is also pretty small as well. And not only are they small, but they're like boxed in. So there's very limited ways for an unrelated animal to get into the area to help diversify the gene pool. And it's also hard for them to get out to find their own territories. And so for the petition for the California mountain lions, that was a really, really big important piece, was the poor genetic health. And the fact that researchers predicted that if inbreeding gets worse and we start seeing, you know, reproductive issues or congenital disease, then the population could get wiped out pretty quickly, like within 50 years or less. And so anyway, so that's a piece of it. And then it gets submitted to the California Fish and Game Commission, and the commissioners vote as to whether or not listing is warranted. And so in 2020, they voted that unanimously, yes, listing is warranted. We want the Department of Fish and Wildlife to do a thorough status review to determine whether or not listing is warranted. And so that's what we're waiting on now. And once they provide that report, the commission will vote again as to whether or not listing is warranted. And then if they vote yes, then that's when the listing becomes formalized and they move from candidate species to either threatened or endangered species. There's a lot of other steps in the middle, but those are the big ones. And so I hope that's helpful and I answered your question, but I'm happy to discuss it more if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you, Tiffany. We're going to throw a question to Elise. It was typed in, and then Stephanie, we see your raised hand. We're going to come to you next. So the question is from David. When the gopher tortoises are relocated, where do they go, and how do they know if they've all been captured or, you know, to relocated? They've got all of them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way it works here in Florida right now is that, let's see, back in like 2008, the state made it so you could no longer bury tortoises in their burrows, because that used to be what happened. And they called it entombment, and it, you know, really horrifying. And so they decided finally that is really unethical, and that these tortoises should be moved off the property. And so they created this entire scheme that's essentially, it's supposed to be a market-driven scheme where they have donor sites, they call them the development site, and then they have recipient sites or relocation sites. And these relocation sites can be public or private lands. But essentially, anytime someone wants to move a tortoise, they have to find a recipient site, and the recipient site gets to charge whatever they want for you to move that tortoise. And so it's a real incentive for people who have undeveloped land to become a recipient site and accept these gopher tortoises. And we've seen some success with that over the years. Until somewhat recently, if you've looked at the news in Florida at all, you may have seen that suddenly, because development was really on the rise and recipient sites weren't being, you know, there just weren't enough recipient sites, the prices to relocate a gopher tortoise got up to like $6,000, $10,000 per tortoise. And basically the lobby for developers went to the agency, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and they went to their legislators and complained about it. And that's how we got to that legislation I was talking about earlier, which essentially flooded this market of mostly private lands with new public lands. And so that's been a real concern, because while it's incredibly humane and wonderful on a per tortoise basis to remove them and make sure they don't get injured, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the species as a whole, because essentially what they're doing is cramming the same amount of tortoises into smaller and smaller areas. And there's been no kind of overall assessment of whether the amount of habitat that's left is even enough for a population across the state that can sustain itself. The state just hasn't looked into that. But looking into that and answering that question is a requirement of the Endangered Species Act at the federal level. And so that's why these tortoises are moved, which is great for the individuals, but we're still concerned about the species as a whole. I hope I answered both parts of your question there.
So Stephanie, why don't you feel free to unmute your line?
Okay, can you hear me?
We sure
we can.
can.
Okay, good. My question would be, if you have an event like, for instance, Florida, you might have a hurricane, or in California, an earthquake, or if we're talking about sea level rise, when you have those areas that are devastated because of those natural events, which are supposed to get worse, is there a way that either the center or the Nature Conservancy can go in, or do they have to have a permit by the city? Because it's private property, but it could be bought out, for instance, because it's becoming less and less habitable. Yet those people keep rebuilding, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. So is it a very possible, pathway, or is it too many hoops to jump through?
I can maybe speak to when you talked about impacts of disasters like hurricanes. A species that immediately came to mind for me is the frosted flatwood salamander, which is this very rare salamander that's found in just a few places in Florida and Georgia. And I believe it was Hurricane Michael that went and hit the panhandle and essentially forced all of the salt water into the freshwater wetlands where these salamanders lived. And there was a really big concern about what was going to happen to the population. And this is a public lands example, so it may not explicitly answer your question, but ultimately what happened is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service worked with the U.S. Geological Survey, and they got all of these cattle tanks, and they actually went and rescued salamanders as they could find them, and they were raising and head starting baby salamanders in these cattle tanks until they felt the habitat was safe enough to reintroduce them. And so you do see these kind of unique, solutions where the circumstances just require us to be creative. And I know there are also a lot of, private public partnerships to protect species, particularly for species like the gopher tortoise. And so, I think there are creative ways to try to address some of these things. But ultimately, the answer is for us to get our carbon output under control and to try to limit the damage that we've already created to our climate.
Actually, what I was hoping is that if you have a hurricane that impacts private property, say in Miami, when you have a hurricane, is there any pathway to offer to buy out those who are immediately on the coast that are impacted by that? Because when they get the hurricane, it devastates everything, including down in Houston. So then the people just rebuild. So it would make sense that maybe if there was another avenue rather than just rebuilding, because it seems that sometimes they think that's the only pathway.
Right. There certainly is a lot of work being done to see how what you're suggesting actually could be done. I've gone to several conferences actually that almost entirely talk about that. it's not an area that, at least in Florida, we've been very intimately involved in. But I'd be interested to ask maybe some of our colleagues in the Climate Law Institute and see what their thoughts are. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that question, Stephanie. We have a question from Sylvia Williams in Washington. Interested in hearing about protections and advocacy for the Florida manatee.
Sure, yeah. You've probably seen that the manatees had a really tough time lately, and that's largely because of poor water quality. And so that's really been the focus of our work here in Florida. And I can name a few actions. One thing we've been really working to do is get better protected habitat for the species under the Endangered Species Act. When the manatee was originally listed, it was also designated what they call critical habitat, which is a protection for the most important places for the manatee to survive and recover. But at the time, the law didn't require that definition to be specific. And so its critical habitat was essentially water. And, without having any criteria for what that water should be like, there really wasn't any kind of meaningful protection for the manatee. Over time, the law and the regulations changed and required more specificity in what we need to protect for species habitat, but the agency had not revised the critical habitat. And so an action we've had recently and had success on is pushing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to agree to redesignate that critical habitat and actually look at what the specific needs are for the manatee. So one of those things that we'd really like to see is criteria for how much nutrient pollution can be dumped into water, because we know that nutrients fuel harmful algal blooms, and algal blooms shade out seagrass, and then manatees have nothing to eat, which is essentially what happened in the Indian River Lagoon, where we saw this massive die-off last year. Another action that we've done actually relates specifically to the Indian River Lagoon. We have a lawsuit right now pending against the Environmental Protection Agency for failing to have stringent enough water quality standards, specifically related to nutrients, to ensure that the water is safe for wildlife and for people. And then one final thing that we're working on, we recognize boat strikes are also a significant threat to the species. And so we're actually working on and should have out soon a petition to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to include manatee protection education and requirements for people who have to get boat licenses. Right now, there's this test you have to take. Well, there's a whole slew of tests that are approved by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And they ultimately decide which tests are good and which ones aren't. And we want them to say a good test tells you about manatees. It shows you what a manatee footprint looks like on the water, what to do if you see a snout, things like that. Because hitting a manatee, I mean, obviously it's really harmful to the manatee, but there's also a lot of human injuries and just really catastrophic crashes. Kind of makes me think of what Tiffany was talking about with the road crashes as well. So that's some of the work we're doing for the manatee right now.
Thanks so much, Elise. Going to put you on the spot again. We probably have time for maybe one or two at most more questions, but we have some Florida fans of Florida animals here. So we have a question from Lane about the status of black bears in Florida. And would you be able to weigh in a bit on what's happening with black bears right now?
Sure. Yeah. I think maybe the short answer is, not a whole lot. Unfortunately, we did have a hunt several years ago, and we've been monitoring that very closely. Speaking with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission officials to make sure that that does not happen again, because that was just unacceptable. And it's something we fought at the time, and unfortunately, we failed to fight back. But yes, we do continue to work with partners on Florida black bear. We did submit a petition for federal listing for a distinct population segment of Florida black bears, but unfortunately, I believe that petition was rejected. It's not something I've directly worked on, and I can follow up on that and let you know afterward. But all of that to say, not a whole lot of movement either way right now, but we're being very vigilant to make sure that we don't see increased threats.
Well, we're closing in swiftly here on the hour, and I want to take a moment just to thank everyone again so much for joining us today, and especially to our panelists, Tiffany and Elise, for sharing their wonderful expertise and for their tireless work to protect species great and small. Your support as Leadership Circle members and Owls Club members make our work possible, and we're so grateful to everyone who took the time to be with us. A final reminder, we'll email an audio recording of the briefing soon, and we'll have a transcript available upon request of the call. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions at any time, and just want to say thank you so much again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.